When you hear the word atheist, what comes to mind? How does it make you feel? When I hear the word atheist or atheism, I immediately think of despicable, with all the froth and contempt that Daffy Duck himself could manage. I think of vile, abhorrent, abominable, the worst of the worst, the lowest of the low. These are the future vermin of hell itself. Well, that's the connotative definition that I think of. And that's true. When I think of atheism, that's how it strikes me. It's like one of the worst words in the entire dictionary. All right, despite that, despite my connotative abhorrence for the word atheist, I realized that I've become one. I, who shudder at the thought of such ribald godlessness, am having to come to terms with the reality that I am, in fact, an atheist. In fact, a very unexpected atheist. Making this transition isn't the easiest journey, and many of you who have deconverted can relate with that, I'm sure, quite strongly. About a week ago, I had the opportunity to go as an atheist for the very first time to a meeting of fellow atheists. And it was an interesting experience for me because it was so different. The demographics in terms of personal expression and appearance skewed more closely to, let's say, a local carnival than to, let's say, an independent fundamentalist Baptist church at 11 o'clock on a Sunday morning. It just wasn't what I was used to given my background. I think a lot of people who were there were probably, I don't want to say lifelong atheists, but closer to that than having deconverted from a long life of being in evangelical/fundamentalist Christianity. I am 49 years old and have just recently deconverted, and very few people do that who are my age, especially given the background that I've had. And just very briefly, I grew up in a Christian high school. I grew up in a Christian home. I attended a Christian college where I majored in Bible. I graduated from a leading accredited evangelical seminary with a master's in theological studies. Was going to head into the ministry, ended up heading into Christian higher education. Taught at 2 Christian universities for a number of years, including courses on Intro to the New Testament and Introduction to Worldview, where you deal with some of the very foundational philosophical issues that undergird the Christian faith and involve some degree of apologetics. And eventually became a trainer in levels 1, 2, and 3 for Evangelism Explosion International, which of course seeks to convert people to Christianity, and was personally trained by the director of Evangelism Explosion in a week-long training course that I took. I even have a brick with my name, a commemorative brick with my name on it at the entrance of the Creation Museum, because I am one of their founding charter members. So I was deep into this stuff and deep into it for most of my life. Reservations began to crop up in my brain when I was 16 years old, and I have been a thinker, so I have really thought through a number of issues and finally just came to the place where I had to admit that I was doubting my faith and continued to do a tremendous amount of thinking and ended up very unexpectedly as an atheist. So when I walked into this group of nearly 200 people last week, it's just a shock to my system. Intellectually, I have moved from theism to atheism, but culturally, socially, in terms of finding my tribe, that's the transition that I'm currently beginning to undertake. And I'm just going to have to meet atheists. And, I've watched YouTube. I've watched a number of the wonderful leading talking heads on YouTube and some of the other programs that are out there. And that's nice. But I think I'm going to learn the heart of atheism as I learn the hearts of the atheists who are around me here in my community. So I find myself asking myself, what is an atheist? What is the atheist movement? What does that look like? What does it feel like? How do atheists act? How do they think? How do they process information, from an epistemological standpoint? And how does that factor into their axiology, into their ethics, into probably, I'm sure, their code of conduct, which would be defined by teleology or consequentialism versus deontology, which is often tied to belief in the scriptures or some type of inscripturated revelation. So I've got a PhD in the social sciences, and my emphasis was in speech communication with a focus on public relations. And part of my dissertation, I used a data technique called factor analysis. And that's where you dump in a whole bunch of factors and you allow the computer to crunch those numbers, and it will pull things that are related together into a cluster. And you have to decipher that statistically. It'd be nice to see it visually as well, which I think you probably could. But if you're looking at fundamentalist Christianity, some of the background that I came out of, especially when you get over more towards the fundamentalist side and less from the evangelical, there is a clustering that factor analysis would produce. It basically puts all those related elements together. And then what you do as a researcher, as a data interpreter, is you draw a circle around those related elements. And you say that this circle represents something. And you have to label what that is. If we were to do that with a wide range of cultural expressions and beliefs and whatever, we could find a cluster, if we collected the right data, that could be called fundamentalist Christianity, which would involve all those things that define what that movement is, what that movement believes, what the people look like, the words that they use, the words they don't use, etc. And there's a really concerted effort, of course, from the pulpit to make everybody look the same. Everybody should conform. And so if you walk into a lot of these independent fundamentalist Baptist churches, especially the new ones, we can include those as well, you're going to find a lot of people looking like they're out of the 1950s. Some of them wearing cheap polyester suits and still using Brill cream on their hair and carrying a gigantic black leather authorized King James 1611 Bible, etc., etc. The hymn singing, the emphasis on soul winning, and all that goes into that. So the factor analysis would yield a result that would show commonality. It would show this condensed core of action and belief that would define a group such as independent fundamental Baptist churches. But when it comes to atheist, I don't think the data would yield that clustering, at least that tightly. And boy, I tell you what, I don't do social science research anymore right now because I'm not funded by a university, but I would love to do it in the future because I would love to answer the question of what is it that makes an atheist an atheist? And that's a question really that is being defined right now in some amazing ways. I'm really new to the whole atheist landscape. Really until probably maybe 18 months ago, I had never heard of any of the atheist people on YouTube. I stumbled across one of Seth Andrews' podcasts, and it was the one about some of the Christian music that he used to spin as a FM DJ. That was fascinating. I mean, here's somebody who came out of a background that was similar to where I came out of. I think that was my first exposure. And then I learned about some guy down in Austin, Texas, this Matt Dillahunty guy who's got this call-in show. And that was fascinating because you had this marvelous give and take between the panelist and the call-in people who had all these questions. Very, very cool. I think Socrates would have been proud of that type of dialogue that was set up. I also discovered Aaron Raw, who's also down in the Southwest, and Those three are, as some of you I'm sure well know, have been defined informally as the unholy trinity, in contrast to the four horsemen of the apocalypse, the other big names within atheism that have kind of defined what it is. So, still very new to this, still asking questions about what an atheist is, what an atheist believes, and how atheists, act. And I think there would be, in the data that was revealed, if you actually did research on this, far more diversity of thought, of expression, mainly because atheism isn't defined as adherence to a particular faith, but it's defined as a process of free thinking, as a process of epistemological inquiry, and using rationality, using reason to arrive at decisions that are reasonable, whether it adheres to a creed that was, written a couple thousand years ago. I'm also really interested in exploring atheism as a movement and looking at it in particular from an organizational standpoint. And as you know, organizations are directed by rules that are written down, by bylaws, for example. But the conduct that often gets people further ahead in the organizations, if they're looking to move up the ladder, to make an impact, to be seen as, being identified with the core of that organization, is to follow a series of unwritten rules. And sometimes those unwritten rules, those unwritten standards of conduct, hold more power in an organization or even in a movement than anything that's really codified and written down. So atheism's emerging. So the movement is growing. And as it grows, there's going to be a greater responsibility to manage resources. And because of that, there's going to be a stronger emphasis on which people in the movement should be charged with the responsibility to manage those resources. And those are the people ultimately who are going to have the power within the movement or within the organizational setting. And that power, that sense of being entrusted with a resource, will be granted to, I believe, people who adhere to what emerges as a set of unwritten rules that kind of govern the movement, that determine who moves up, that determine who really should be a spokesperson for the organization, at least at an organizational level. So where am I heading in the future with this podcast or set of videos that might emerge into a podcast? The first thing is I've got a lot of things that I want to share. I was a professor for 16 years full-time and ended up leaving academia about 6 years ago. So I have been in a zone of silence really for quite some time and am looking to just share some of the insights. I've learned so much about life here in the last really 3 or 4 years, and this project will be a result of that. And the second is I have questions. I still have a lot of questions about atheism, but also questions about the Christian faith. Questions about the Bible in particular, despite having a seminary degree and learned Koine Greek and blah, 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 all that stuff in my past. I want to explore a lot of these topics again with fresh eyes and be able to share the results of what I'm learning about on here. I had a professor in college who borrowed a quotation from somebody else, as it turns out, but basically it was along the lines of this. How can you know what you mean until you see what you say? That didn't make a whole lot of sense to me when I first heard it. How can you know what you mean until you see what you say? In other words, you really have to talk through some things out loud before you can get a solid sense of what you're really saying. And I think that's what I need to do in this whole process of Becoming an atheist most unexpectedly. I need to hear myself answer certain questions. And I've heard some of those questions answered by others, but I need to hear my own voice say it in my words and in my style. So where's this whole thing going to head? Wide range of topics. One, for example, is leadership. I taught a capstone course in leadership at the university I was at and directed the leadership program, and used a book called The Leadership Challenge by Kouzes and Posner. Fascinating book. It's got 10 major principles that leaders have been proven to follow. In other words, if you look at effective leaders, they tend to do these things. I like to define leadership in terms of functional influence. In other words, leadership is not just saying that you're a leader. Leadership is not just talking about leadership on your Facebook page or on LinkedIn. Leadership is tied directly to the influence that you bring about through your actions. As I look at the atheist movement, I'm just fascinated by this because it's pretty interesting in the sense that you've got this group of people that are beginning to coalesce into communities. As those organizations form at the local level, that's where I'm curious about the function of leadership. So Kouzes and Posner, for example, talk about 5 practices and 10 commitments to exemplary leadership. They talk about effective leaders model the way. They secondly inspire a shared vision. They thirdly challenge the process. They fourthly enable others to act. And then finally, they encourage the heart. So those are 5 practices, and each practice has 2 commitments, which are fascinating. So under modeling the way, for example, the very first practice, the first commitment is to clarify values by finding your voice and affirming shared values. Now, it seems that Christianity or Islam or Judaism has just got the hands up when it comes to this because they already have a set of predefined values, the received wisdom that they can just continue to pass on, and boom, there it is. But if you're an atheist, what exactly are your values? Again, you don't have a creed. You don't have the Westminster Confession of Faith, the Nicene Creed, the Heidelberg Catechism, all that stuff that defines exactly not only what you believe, but how you're supposed to act. So what are the values that atheists have? That will be fascinating to see, especially from leaders. Inspiring a shared vision. I'm really curious to see what the vision of leaders at the local organization would be. And it could, of course, be contextualized depending on where they are. I think the third one, challenging the process, which is the third of the 5 practices, is probably what many in the atheist community are probably best at. Just saying, look, the Freedom from Religion Foundation, here's the status quo, we're not happy with it, and so we're going to challenge that process, and we're going to do it legally, we're going to do it through channels of protest, etc. Now, these last 2 practices of the 5 are fascinating to me because I think they, again, most closely correlate with organized religion. Enabling others to act, for example, maybe not that one so strongly, but it's defined as these 2 practices or these 2 commitments. Number 1, foster collaboration by building trust and facilitating relationships. To what extent does an atheist leader at a local organization foster collaboration by building trust and facilitating relationships? And, the trend in evangelical Christianity anyway is the closing of the mainline Protestant churches and just the volcanic eruption of these mega churches all across the country. And a lot of those churches are so big that on Sunday morning, at least, they fail to provide a sense of community, at least on a personal level. So they're smart enough to organize the church into much smaller groups. Adult Bible fellowships used to be called Sunday school, and even home groups to be able to foster those relationships. Curious to see how the atheist community might do that. Another commitment underneath enabling others to act is to strengthen others by increasing self-determination and developing competence. That applies more to, I think, workers doing a particular task, but there's certainly, areas that people can be trained in. I mean, I trained Christians on how to share the gospel, the good news with the lost and dying world. What would that look like for an atheist to train others to share the gospel of atheism? I used to teach a course on televangelism at the university level for freshmen, but then also for adult students, average age probably 35. Completely different experiences when you have those two wildly different demographics. But anyway, we looked at some televangelists, like straight up televangelists, like the ones you would think of. But then we also looked at other people who weren't really preachers by any means, but still had some good news to share. Gandhi, for example, Oprah with her brand of spirituality, and others. Anyway, I'm curious again to see what the good news of atheism would be. Not just in terms of the features, but the benefits. I mean, Christianity, man, or even Islam, they've kind of got the corner when it comes to talking about the afterlife and the billions and billions and infinity of billions of years spent in eternal bliss in heaven, or the whole 72 virgins thing, etc. All right, the 5 practices. The 5th one is to encourage the heart. This is divided up into recognizing contributions by showing appreciation for individual excellence. And then finally, celebrating the values and victories by creating a spirit of community. So what I'm likely to do in this series is to take a look at each of those 10 commitments and to break those down. I would love to do discussions with area leaders and paint a picture of kind of what is the status quo when it comes to leadership in atheism at the local level right now in terms of these 10 very well-established benchmarks for effective leadership. If I'm able to do some research and collect data, then I think I would have some really good insights and be able to make a contribution to the community here. It's interesting. One of the elements in leadership is to talk about leaving a legacy. What is the legacy that you want to leave? Was out at a cemetery in Dallas, Texas recently, and they had one of these buildings, I think it's a columbarium or something like that, where they put the ashes of people, and I took a picture. I'll put it up here on the screen so you can see what one of these looks like, and it's almost like a shadow box, this little collection that distills what your life was like. It's like you run your entire life through a sifter, and these are the few pebbles that are left. This is the distilled essence of what you were in life. Anyway, up to this point, I've always kind of thought, well, leaving a legacy is important. Then I heard Aaron Ra the other day. Actually woke me up as I had YouTube playing probably at 2 o'clock in the morning as I had fallen asleep. And he yelled about something and was talking about the fact that, look, there is no afterlife. You weren't here before you were born. You're not going to be here after you die. And I can't remember if he directly talked about legacies, but he made the point that you're going to be forgotten. And you're going to be forgotten, certainly in the active memories of all the people who are alive now. They're going to die off, and then you're gone. And then you're just part of history until all that stuff evaporates, eventually as well. So it's like, wow. Maybe a legacy isn't as lasting as I had always dreamed and hoped it would be. So kind of like, what's the point? What's the point of leaving this huge legacy? So I'm working through some of those issues as well. It's fascinating when you change the foundation of your brain's, basically its operating system. When you go from theism to atheism, it is such a profoundly radical change. It's like taking a piece of hardware as a computer and going from, Macintosh operating system over to PC, over to Windows. Assuming there's no way to integrate those two programs. And so, there are things that I have thought about in the past that just like those apps no longer work because my operating system no longer drives them. And leaving a legacy is one of those that I'm looking at now from a different light. And I'm like, maybe obsessing over leaving a legacy is nothing more than narcissism. So that's the first episode, just explaining a little bit about what this series is and where it's headed. I've got I've got probably 30 or 40 topics written down where I'll talk about different issues. Explore the leadership one as well at some point. And I'd like to visit local churches in the place where I'm at and, come out of that from kind of an ethnographic standpoint and emerge to tell the story of what I heard, what I saw, how was I treated. Send me a message if you wish on Facebook. You can always message me on the Facebook page for The Unexpected Atheist.